The night everything ended, I was carrying my mother-in-law's birthday cake into the dining room when my wife's phone lit up on the kitchen counter with a message that said, "I missed last night already." I still remember the way the frosting shifted slightly under my fingers when I stopped walking. It was one of those small sheet cakes from the bakery Naomi liked. White buttercream, pale peach piping. "Happy 65th, Lorraine," written in careful script. The kind of cake meant for ordinary family milestones. The kind that belongs in photos with wine glasses and forced smiles and people pretending they still know each other. I stood there in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, staring at the phone screen, while conversation drifted toward me in fragments from the next room. Naomi's brother was telling some long story about a neighbor's dog. Her mother laughed too loudly. My wife was at the table pouring wine, smiling that polished, effortless smile that had once made me feel like the luckiest man in Georgia. And on the counter, her phone glowed again. Another message. "Wish I could have stayed longer." For a second, the entire house seemed to go soundless, like someone had thrown a blanket over the world. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 41 years old that night, and I made my living as an insurance adjuster, the kind of man people stop listening to the moment they think they understand him. On paper, I was quiet, practical, forgettable. I worked long hours, drove a clean but aging pickup truck, paid the mortgage on time, and had the sort of face people trust when they need bad news explained gently. What very few people knew, what even my wife only understood in outline, was that before insurance, I had spent nearly 8 years doing digital fraud investigation for a private intelligence contractor. I used to untangle shell transactions, staged losses, false identities, and quiet little empires of deception built by ordinary-looking people in pressed shirts and wedding bands. I had left that world because it started changing the way I looked at everyone. Once you spend enough time inside fraud, you stop hearing words and start hearing gaps. You stop trusting stories and start trusting patterns. For 12 years, Naomi had been the one place in my life where I tried not to do that. That was probably my first mistake. From the outside, our marriage looked stable in the exact way stable marriages are supposed to look. We lived in a good subdivision outside Atlanta, one of those neighborhoods full of brick homes, crepe myrtles, and evenly cut lawns where everyone smiles from the driveway and nobody admits to anything serious until lawyers get involved. Our house wasn't flashy, but it was beautiful in a respectable, mortgage-approved kind of way. 2 stories, white trim, clean kitchen, granite counters. Naomi had picked out herself after 6 weekends of pretending it wasn't a major decision. We didn't have kids, which people commented on more than they should have. We had routines instead. Sunday grocery runs, Tuesday meal prep, separate gym schedules, different corners of the house for different lives. Naomi liked that we were independent but aligned. That was one of her phrases. She loved phrases that made ordinary emotional distance sound modern and healthy. She worked in regional healthcare administration, which meant meetings, soft blouses, laptop bags, and a lot of vague exhaustion. She was beautiful in a polished, careful way. Dark blonde hair she kept just above her shoulders. Clear skin, good posture, the kind of woman who always looked as if she had already decided how she wanted to be seen before she walked into a room. I used to admire that about her. In those early years, I told myself we had built something adult. Not dramatic, not chaotic, no slammed doors or drunk apologies or screaming matches on front lawns. Just a quiet marriage between 2 competent people who respected each other's space. And maybe that was true for a while. But the last year of our marriage changed by inches, not explosions. Naomi started missing Sunday dinners with my family. At first it was one here and there. A headache, a late report for Monday, a friend going through something. Then it became almost routine. She'd kiss my cheek, say, "Tell your mom I'm sorry," and vanish into some polished excuse that made me sound unreasonable if I questioned it. Then her Pilates classes got longer. Not by a lot at first. 20 minutes, 30, then sometimes 90. She switched studios twice in 6 months, and somehow never seemed annoyed by the extra drive time. She started coming home smelling faintly of expensive shampoo and something else I couldn't place. Not perfume exactly. Something woodier, colder, masculine enough that once, while she bent over to tie her shoes in the mudroom, I caught it and thought, that doesn't belong in this house. She also started hiding her phone in ways too subtle for most people to clock and too obvious for me to miss. Tilting the screen away, flipping it face down when I walked into the room, taking it with her to the bathroom, bringing it downstairs for a glass of water at 2 in the morning, as though hydration suddenly required a passcode. If I had been one of my old clients, I would have flagged the situation months earlier. But love and habit, and the basic human terror of being made a fool, will stretch denial into absurd shapes. I told myself she was stressed. That middle age does strange things to marriages that aren't actually broken. That distance didn't have to mean danger. That we were just busy. The text on the counter that night was the first moment I could no longer tell myself a gentler story. I set the cake down slowly. Naomi called from the dining room. "You need help?" "No," I said, and somehow my voice sounded normal. "I got it." I picked up her phone. I did not unlock it. I didn't need to. The preview was enough. There was no name saved, just a number. But the tone of it, the intimacy without caution, the assumption that last night would mean exactly what it sounded like, it hit with the clean force of a blade. I slid the phone back exactly where it had been and carried the cake to the table. Naomi smiled at me as I set it down. I remember that smile more vividly than the messages. It was warm, familiar, easy. It belonged to a woman who thought her secret life was still safely tucked behind all the right doors. We sang to her mother. We cut cake. Her brother made a dumb joke about aging gracefully. Naomi touched my hand under the table once, the absent-minded kind of marital touch people make when they've forgotten the other person is real. I smiled when appropriate. I cleared plates. I even packed leftover cake into one of those square plastic carriers Naomi liked. Then, after everyone left and the house finally emptied out, I asked her the simplest question I could think of. "Who texted you during dinner?" She didn't freeze. That was the first thing that told me how practiced she had become. Instead, she frowned slightly, as if trying to recall a minor work annoyance. "Probably Dana," she said. "Why?" I leaned against the island and watched her rinse glasses. She said she missed last night already. Naomi didn't turn around immediately. She kept the water running a second too long. Then she laughed lightly. "Oh my God, that sounds terrible. She and I grabbed drinks after Pilates last night, and I left early because I was tired." She was probably being dramatic. That answer was elegant enough to pass with a husband less tired than I was. Maybe even with me, 6 months earlier. I nodded and said, "Got it." Then I went upstairs, brushed my teeth, and lay beside my wife in the dark while she scrolled silently next to me, the light from her screen hitting the ceiling in little white pulses. I listened to her breathing slow into sleep around midnight. At 12:23 a.m., I got out of bed, took my phone downstairs, and started working. The first thing I checked was the phone bill. People imagine phone records tell you everything. They don't, but they tell you what to look at next. I pulled the last 6 months of logs and found the number from dinner within 10 minutes. It appeared often enough to matter and irregularly enough to suggest concealment. Not daily. That would have been sloppy. More like clustered bursts. Thursday nights, late Tuesday afternoons, 2 Saturday windows, several calls under 2 minutes, the kind people make when they already know what they want to say. I copied the number. Then I checked our shared accounts. Not because I assumed money was involved, but because money always touches the edges of deceit if you know how to follow it. I started broad. Credit cards, debit charges, payment apps, ride shares, a rewards card tied to grocery and fuel purchases. Nothing dramatic at first. Then I noticed the withdrawals. Small amounts, $70, $92, $120. Cashback added onto grocery transactions. Extra money folded invisibly into Target runs and pharmacy stops. Not enough to ring alarm bells. Just enough to accumulate. I built a quick spreadsheet and stared at it under the light of the range hood while the refrigerator hummed beside me. Over 8 months, Naomi had quietly moved more than $11,000 out of our shared life in increments too ordinary to feel criminal. That number alone would have been enough to change the temperature of the room. But around 1:40, I found the first real fracture line. A charge on our shared rewards card from a building supply company 40 miles north of us. Lumber, fasteners, weatherproofing materials. Not a giant amount, but not household either. A week later, another charge from a home goods store in the same county. Then a delivery fee from a local appliance company. Then gas purchases in the same area. I zoomed out and looked at the dates. They lined up with several of Naomi's late Pilates nights. At 2:11 a.m., I ran the mystery number through a contact database I still had lawful access to through an old investigator friend who owed me 3 favors and had once told me, only half joking, that I was the only honest man he'd ever met in fraud. The number came back to a man named Eli Mercer. Local contractor. Residential renovation specialist. Married once, divorced 4 years. No kids. Clean enough public presence to avoid suspicion. Exactly the sort of man you'd hire to renovate a kitchen, and then accidentally let into your life in other ways. I knew the name immediately. Eli had been in my house twice the previous spring to quote a remodel Naomi said we couldn't afford. I sat back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment. There's a kind of nausea that isn't physical at first. It begins as rearrangement. Your memory starts taking new positions around a fact you never wanted. Her standing too close when he described backsplash options. The way she laughed at one of his stories, even though it wasn't funny. How she later said he had good energy, which at the time had sounded like the kind of meaningless compliment women use for service providers they don't dislike. By morning, I knew enough to stop hoping, but not enough to stop digging. The next week of my life was one of the strangest I've ever lived because I stayed inside the marriage while privately documenting its funeral. I watched Naomi the way I used to watch claimants I knew were staging losses. Not cruelly, not obsessively, just attentively. She played her role beautifully. She asked if I wanted coffee before work. She texted me one afternoon to say she missed me, and I actually laughed when I read it. She complained about traffic, about a woman at Pilates who wouldn't stop talking, about her brother forgetting their mother's prescription pickup. She folded laundry while humming under her breath. She left one of her earrings on the bathroom sink and kissed me absent-mindedly before bed. The ordinary intimacy of lying is what makes betrayal so hard to describe to people who haven't felt it. It isn't just that they cheat. It's that they continue participating in the rituals of your shared life while knowing the foundation has already cracked. 3 days after the birthday dinner, another piece surfaced. My sister-in-law, Kelsey, Naomi's brother's wife, called me while I was on the road between inspections. She sounded hesitant in a way that made me pull into an empty church parking lot before taking her off speaker. "Can I ask you something weird?" she said. "Sure. Was Naomi with you last Thursday night?" My hand tightened on the steering wheel. Why a pause? Because she told Lorraine she was with me. Like specifically with me. Shopping and then wine. But I was home with Ben and the kids. For a second I watched a pine branch scrape lightly against my windshield in the wind. What made that come up? Her mom mentioned it Sunday. Said she was glad Naomi got a girls' night with me because I've been such a comfort lately, and I had no idea what she was talking about. Kelsey was not a malicious woman. She was too blunt for that. And in her bluntness, she gave me one of the cleanest gifts a betrayed person can receive: confirmation from someone who did not mean to provide it. "Thanks for telling me," I said. "Marcus, is everything okay?" "No," I said honestly. "But it will be." That night, while Naomi slept, I searched county property records tied to Eli Mercer. Nothing in his name. Then I widened the search. 2 days later, through a nested LLC registered by a generic local attorney, I found the cabin. 1 bedroom, lake frontage, 48 miles from our house. Purchased 9 months earlier. The mailing address for tax notices was not Naomi S. and not Eli S. It was a rented mailbox in Alpharetta. But the first tax installment had been paid from an account number partially matching the tail end of one of our joint bank drafts. That was the moment the story stopped being an affair and became a plan. Not just sneaking around. Construction. Second Life Construction. I drove out there that Saturday under the pretense of checking storm damage on a roof claim. The road narrowed into trees, and eventually the asphalt gave way to gravel, and then to that soft, isolated quiet lake areas have when they're expensive enough to feel private but undeveloped enough to feel unfinished. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Fresh cedar, dark trim, new lock on the door, a porch with 2 rocking chairs, not yet weathered enough to look lived in. I parked half a mile away and walked the rest. At the front door, installed neatly beside the frame, was a keypad lock. The code pad was dark, but when I touched it, the screen lit up. Someone had left faint smudges on the numbers. I looked at them a long time. 0914, Naomi's birthday. I stood on that porch with the lake moving quietly behind the trees and felt the last of my uncertainty leave me. When I got home, Naomi was in the kitchen making salmon and pretending we were the sort of couple who discussed herb choices while building a future. "How was your day?" she asked. "Productive, that's good." She smiled without looking up. I looked at my wife of 12 years and realized she had built a place to leave me before she ever gathered the courage to say she wanted out. But it got worse, because while I was still absorbing the existence of the cabin, I uncovered the counterfeit narrative she had been preparing in case she needed to use it. Through public-facing search history recovered from a shared browser she had apparently forgotten synced across devices, Naomi had been reading articles with titles like asterisk documenting emotional neglect in marriage asterisk, can a spouse keep the house during separation, and how to explain leaving a distant partner to family. I sat in my office staring at those search results and felt something colder than hurt settle into my chest. She wasn't just cheating. She was preparing a story in which I became the reason. That old instinct from my fraud years came back then, not as suspicion but as structure. I printed everything: dates, charges, records, screenshots, call logs, property filings, search history. I built a timeline on my office wall the way I used to build case trees for staged catastrophe claims. At the center of it all was one ugly truth. Naomi had not drifted into betrayal because we were disconnected. She had built betrayal into a future narrative where I would be cast as the man too emotionally absent to save his own marriage. That changed something in me. Until then, part of me had still been mourning. After that, I started planning. I called a lawyer Monday morning. Not because I wanted war, but because I wanted sequence. I wanted to know what was mine, what was documented, what mattered legally, and what I could prove if Naomi decided to turn grief into accusation. My lawyer was a woman named Ellen Sykes, who had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many marriages reduced to inventory. She listened without interruption, then said, "Good. You brought records instead of feelings. That will save you money." I almost smiled. We discussed the house, the accounts, the transfers, and the fact that Naomi had used shared funds to support a concealed relationship and potentially a jointly hidden property interest. Ellen told me not to confront her yet. "If she knows you know," she said, "she'll start deleting and reframing. Right now, she thinks she controls the timeline. Let her." So I did. And the confrontation came 3 weeks later, on a Saturday evening, at my own dining room table during another family dinner. Naomi's mother had wanted a makeup celebration because the previous birthday dinner had felt rushed. That was her word. Rushed, as if the rot under the tablecloth had only needed better pacing. This time, her brother Ben was there with Kelsey. Her mother Lorraine arrived with a casserole nobody touched. Naomi wore a cream sweater that made her look soft and innocent, which I'm sure was accidental in the same way snakes accidentally look like rope in tall grass. I let everyone sit. I let Naomi pour wine. I let the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary fill the house like a normal evening. Then, before dessert, I stood up, walked to the sideboard and brought a slim stack of folders to the table. Naomi looked up first. "What's that?" I set the documents down in front of me and opened the top folder. "Before anyone cuts cake," I said, "Naomi needs to explain whose lake cabin I've been helping pay for." The room didn't explode. It stopped. That's the only word for it. Lorraine blinked. Ben frowned. Kelsey went very still. Naomi's face lost all color at once. "Marcus," she said softly, warningly, like I was the one misbehaving. I slid the property tax notice across the table. Then the supply receipts. Then the card activity. Then a photograph of the keypad installation invoice. Then the call records tied to Eli Mercer. Ben looked from the papers to Naomi with the expression of a man, realizing the room has become dangerous. "What is this?" Lorraine asked. Naomi stood too quickly and knocked her wineglass over. Red wine spread across the table runner in a dark line. "Marcus, this is insane," she said. "You've been spying on me." "No," I said. "I've been paying attention." I pulled out the screenshot of the text from the birthday dinner. Then a printed sheet of the message history timing. Then the log showing her fake Pilates nights. Then Kelsey's name on the false alibi trail. Kelsey shut her eyes briefly. Ben said, "Naomi, please tell me this isn't what it looks like." She didn't answer him. Instead, she turned on me exactly the way I knew she would have cornered. "You went through my private things," she said, voice shaking. "You tracked me. You dug through my searches. Do you hear how sick that sounds?" There it was. The pivot. Not remorse. Not confession. Moral inversion. I had seen it hundreds of times in fraud interviews. The guilty party reaches for outrage, because outrage moves faster than accountability. "You told people I was emotionally neglectful before you ever left," I said. "You used our money to help build a second life with another man. You used Kelsey as a fake alibi. You put his cabin code as your birthday. You've been lying to my face for months. Do not stand in my house and pretend this is about privacy." Lorraine made a small choked sound. Naomi's eyes filled with tears then, but I didn't believe in them anymore. "You've been gone for years," she whispered. "You just didn't know it. You live in your own head. You make everything into a report. You don't feel anything until there's a spreadsheet attached." That hurt because it wasn't entirely false. The most effective lies always contain a vein of truth. I took a slow breath. "If you wanted to leave me," I said, "you could have left. If you hated me, you could have said so. If I made you lonely, you could have said that too. But instead you built a hideout, stole from me to fund it, and started writing a version of our marriage where I was the reason you cheated." Naomi looked around the table for allies and found none. Ben stood up and walked to the sink, both hands braced on the counter. Kelsey stared at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into something gentler. Lorraine started crying in a quiet, bewildered way that made her seem suddenly much older. "Who is he?" Ben asked finally. Naomi closed her eyes. When she opened them, the fight had gone out of her voice. "Eli." The name landed like a gavel. Nobody yelled after that. Real family collapse is often quieter than television teaches you. Ben asked one or two practical questions. Lorraine asked how long. Kelsey said nothing at all, which somehow felt more condemning than if she'd screamed. Naomi cried and said she hadn't meant for it to go this far. I almost asked her at what point exactly this far began. The first text. The first lie. The first cash withdrawal. The first time she put my money into another man's walls. But I was too tired. When the truth cornered her, Naomi tried the only thing she had left. She said I had been emotionally absent for years. She said the marriage had been empty long before Eli. She said she had felt invisible. She said she had needed something alive. Again, none of that was wholly fabricated. Marriage failures rarely belong to one person entirely. But loneliness is not a permit for deceit. Eventually, Ben took Lorraine home. Kelsey hugged me before she left, which surprised us both. Naomi stood in the foyer like someone who had missed a step in the dark and still hadn't hit the floor. "Are you throwing me out?" she asked. I looked at her for a long time. "No," I said, "but this version of us is over." She moved into a furnished rental 11 days later. Eli, predictably, stopped answering her with the same urgency he'd once used to meet her at the cabin. Men who enjoy secret romance often lose their appetite when secrecy turns into logistics. The cabin stayed in limbo for a while, then quietly hit the market 6 months later at a loss. The divorce was not quick, but it was clean enough. My evidence mattered. The financial tracing mattered. The narrative she had been preparing mattered. So did the fact that she had used marital money to finance the affair. No courtroom drama. No screaming. Just signatures, disclosures, a house sold 1 year later, and the familiar bureaucratic language people use when describing the death of something they once swore was sacred. In the end, I lost the marriage I thought I had, but I finally understood something I had avoided for years. Calm is not the same thing as intimacy. Silence is not the same thing as peace. And a life that looks orderly from the street can still be collapsing room by room behind closed doors. A month after the divorce was final, I went back to the old house to collect the last few things from the pantry and hall closet, while the buyer's final walkthrough was scheduled for the next morning. The place smelled faintly empty already, like cardboard and dust and cleaned out years. In the kitchen, shoved to the back of a lower cabinet behind a bundt pan and two unused serving platters, I found the plastic cake carrier from Lorraine's birthday dinner. I pulled it out and just stood there holding it. A cheap square carrier with a pink latch on one side. Inside, still faintly visible under the scratched plastic, were a few dried smears of white buttercream from the cake nobody really ate after the truth came out. That was the last thing I remember from that house. Not Naomi crying. Not the signed papers. Not the empty closet. Just me standing alone in a quiet kitchen, holding a half-forgotten cake carrier in both hands, realizing I had been the last person in that marriage still protecting the illusion. And maybe that was the real ending. Not the affair. Not the confrontation. Not even the divorce. The ending was the moment I understood that love can survive disappointment, stress, boredom, distance, even seasons of silence. But it cannot survive contempt. Once someone starts turning your trust into a private joke, the marriage is already living on borrowed time. So yes, I lost my wife. Yes, I lost the home we built. Yes, I lost the version of my life I had spent 12 years defending. But I also lost the lie. And after enough time passes, after enough quiet mornings and empty evenings and hard-earned honesty, losing the lie starts to feel less like destruction and more like oxygen. That was the story. That was how it ended. With a phone screen, a lake cabin, an untouched cake, and the slow, brutal clarity that some people don't leave all at once. They leave in pieces. And by the time you finally see it, all you can do is decide whether you're going to keep setting the table for someone who already moved out in their heart.